My name is Mark, a recording angel. I've been observing this earth since the dawn of creation. The Most High has asked me to share my recordings with you. The following are my records of the history of God's true church, down through centuries of oppression, and onward until the promised earth is made new once more, collected in this book, War of the Invisibles, the amazing story of the great controversy. If today's recording contains situations which might be uncomfortable for younger listeners, I will mark the video with the words parental guidance recommended.
Chapter 2 Joe, Rome, AD 67. The stabbing pain in his side grew stronger, and his lungs screamed for air as Joe sprinted around the corner. The mob was close on his heels. Frantically, he dodged into a doorway and disappeared. The mob surged around the corner and past the doorway into the street. "Where did he go? Where did he go?" they cried. Joe held his breath as the mob passed, then he carefully moved a trunk from the corner of the room. It was an ordinary trunk, like any other trunk in that part of town where the family kept their few belongings. Under the trunk was a trapdoor. He quickly opened it and dropped through, pulling it shut behind him. There was no one to replace the trunk over the trapdoor, and he hoped Cornelius would come home first and not be angry with him for leaving it that way. It was an emergency. It couldn't be helped. He dropped into the tunnel and started walking westward. Several minutes passed before his eyes got used to the darkness. As adaptable as his eyes were, being human, he couldn't see the guardians who stood at the door while he moved the trunk and opened the trapdoor. Nor could he see them maintaining their vigil over the tiny apartment that concealed the entrance to the underground maze of tunnels known as the catacombs. Ignoring the pain in his side, Joe continued to move briskly down the tunnels. Carefully he counted his paces so that he would know where to turn in the darkness. As he rounded another corner, he saw a glow up ahead. He pressed eagerly toward it. In a hollowed-out room sat several believers.
"Joseph," gasped Anna, running over to him. "You are safe. We've been quite worried about you."
The guardian standing by Anna smiled, and I nodded. "Of course you've been worried," I thought. "That's why the guardians impressed you to pray for Joe, to give them permission to protect him."
"God is good," Joe said breathlessly. "He spared my life and helped me escape, but they got Marcus."
Anna let out a little cry.
"Oh, Marcus!"
The other believers surged forward to comfort Anna.
"Oh, my brother! My brother!"
she sobbed. "You must be strong," Joe said. "Marcus would want you to. Marcus loves the Lord, and if it means giving his life, he will."
"I know,"
Anna sobbed.
"I know he loves the Lord, and I know the Lord loves him. It's just that it seems so unfair. We've been accused of these horrible things that none of us have done, and then we get sentenced to death. And it's not as if it's an execution where we're allowed to mourn for them. We're executed for entertainment at parties and for fun. It's bad enough to imagine my brother suffering without imagining the crowds cheering and clapping as he cries in agony."
"Stop," Joe exclaimed. "These kinds of thoughts aren't going to help you. We need to keep our minds fixed on Jesus and his promises, or it will make us crazy." The other believers nodded. I smiled at the guardians as we watched the little band of believers press together and pray even more earnestly. The enemy had been particularly cruel and had been creative in finding ways of killing and torturing the believers. And yet, instead of driving them away from God, persecution just drew them closer to him and to each other. One more failure for the rebellion. God's people remain loyal. While it is hard being a recorder of such suffering, it is encouraging to see the steadfast loyalty from humans who had been apparently weak until this point. Joe was right. God is good. Marcus, Mamertine Prison, Rome, AD 67. Marcus leaned against the stone-cold wall in the damp Roman prison cell. He touched the bruises on his arm gingerly. I guess I'll live, he muttered to himself. His eyes were adjusting to the darkness, and as he glanced around, he realized he was not alone. The others in the cell seemed divided into two groups. There was a small, loose knot of men on one side, and 3 or 4 tough-looking loners standing around by themselves. Marcus sat in silence. He was not sure that being in a jail cell would be any safer than being in the hands of those who had beaten him and brought him here. Was he in a room with murderers and criminals, or were these other believers who were in here for the same reason he was? After a short time, one left the small group in the corner and approached Marcus timidly.
"What brings you here, young man?"
he asked. Marcus looked up at him, trying to form an answer. The huge man leaning against the wall on the other side laughed harshly.
"Nah, same thing as the rest of us, you idiot," he said. "This part of the jail is only for the most toughened criminals. We're being saved for something special."
He glanced at Marcus.
"This one does look pretty young and scrawny to be a bandit, though. Perhaps he's just a pickpocket who annoyed someone particularly important."
Marcus shook his head. "I'm no thief."
"Oh,"
the big man said respectfully.
"A wily murderer. You're more dangerous than you look."
The older man, who had approached Marcus first, backed timidly toward his corner. Marcus stood painfully, holding onto the wall for support. The room seemed to spin around him, but soon his vision cleared. "No," he replied. "I am in here for being a follower of the way." The big man spat on the floor.
"A Christian!"
The older man now rushed toward Marcus.
"You're among friends," he said. "There are 5 of us here."
"Christians?" Marcus asked.
"Why, yes. Perhaps we know some of the same people."
He put his arm around Marcus's shoulders and shepherded him toward their corner. The other loners looked at each other and shook their heads.
"Well," one said, "this used to be a prison for the toughest criminals. Now we have to share it here with all these religious weaklings who are too insane to realize what their choices will cost them."
The old man drew himself to his full height and turned to face them.
"No,"
he replied.
"We're not too insane to know what our choices cost. But we give our lives gladly for one who gave his life for us. And we know what we're doing."
The second loner looked at the first and shook his head.
"I know why we're in here," he muttered, "but these weaklings frighten me."
The other tough nodded, and although the cell was small, the distance between the two groups seemed to widen. The guardians smiled. Even these degenerate toughs in a prison cell could sense the power of the Mighty One through these Christians. The guardians would not have to do any physical protecting today. Just the sense of his power was enough.
"On your feet, Christians," the soldier shouted. "It's time to go."
Marcus struggled to his feet. The older man who had befriended him squeezed his arm and whispered,
"Blessed are you when you are persecuted for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven."
Marcus smiled. "We've got heavy rewards coming, my friend." The soldier shook his head. These Christians were spooky to deal with. Some of them insisted on being crucified upside down because they weren't good enough to die the way their Christ had been crucified. Some wouldn't die, no matter what they had done to them, and they were sent to work in the quarries on the island of Patmos. All of them acted as if other beings were around. It was just creepy. The soldier would rather fight 100 barbarians than deal with these strange folk. Marcus and his friends broke into song as the soldiers marched them from the prison to the palace. The closer they got to the palace, the louder their singing became.
"Didn't your God tell you that you were supposed to be the light of the world?" one soldier sneered. "And this is the closest you'll come to that. You're going to be the light of Nero's banquet."
Marcus tried not to listen and just sang louder.
"If that's the kind of light you want me to be, God," he prayed silently, "then that's all right with me. Just help me to be brave and not embarrass you. I want to be a good representative for you."
The soldiers dragged the little group to the stakes strategically placed around the banqueting area. Wood was already piled around them. They chained one man to each stake and then doused all of them with heavy black oil. As the soldier leaned forward to light Marcus's wood with his torch, Marcus began to shake. His guardian drew closer and place his hands around the boy's shoulders. Look up, he whispered. Marcus turned his face skyward. I see him, he cried. The other human torches were looking up too, their faces strangely lighted. A booming voice surrounded them.
Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life.
They were filled with joy and comfort, and as the breath left their bodies, the guardians and I both heaved a sigh of relief. In their human consciousness, in their next split second, they would see the Holy One coming in the clouds, and they would be rising to meet him in the air, rising with new bodies, no more pain, no more suffering. I smiled as I turned from the grim scene. How good our Master is! How faithful never to let the weakest of his followers die alone, without encouragement. Epilogue. Though Marcus and many others died for their faith, Joe, Anna, and others carried on, and the little groups in the catacombs grew faster than Nero's persecution could kill them off. The guardians were not always allowed to save the lives of those they cared for, but they were always with them, and the Almighty never left them alone during their difficult times.
This broadcast has come from the book War of the Invisibles by Sally Pierson Dillon, with permission from the Review and Herald Publishing Association. This book and the rest of the series, War of the Ages, can be purchased by going to www.adventistbookcenter.com or by calling 1-800-765-6955. I'm your narrator, Austin Backus, and this audio project is a gift to you from my free Christian book ministry, RXF 1888. Please visit our website, www.rxf1888.com, to request free Christian books for both kids and adults. And join us here again for more stories from Mark the Recording Angel.